Every sport has its heroes. Every sport has its villains. But no sport in America has ever drawn the line between the two as sharply, as personally, and as loudly as NASCAR. These are not just opinions. These are decades of crowds booing at the top of their lungs, decades of standing ovations that shook grandstands, decades of fans painting names on bed sheets and holding them up in turn 3 while their voices gave out from screaming. 10 drivers, ranked from the most controversial to the ones this sport was built to celebrate, the ones who made you grip your armrests, the ones who made you cry when they won, the ones who made 60,000 people boo so loud the broadcast booth could barely hear itself think. We are starting at the bottom, the drivers who made enemies faster than they made fans, and we are working our way up, all the way to the name that every single person reading this already knows is coming. You already know who number 1 is. You just do not know the full story yet. Number 10, Brad Keselowski. Brad Keselowski did not set out to make enemies. He just could not seem to stop making them. The Michigan native arrived in the Cup Series with a chip on his shoulder the size of a superspeedway and a driving style that made people in the garage take notice in the worst possible way. Not because he was slow, because he was fast and aggressive and completely uninterested in the idea that someone else's feelings should factor into how he raced. In 2010, Carl Edwards deliberately drove into the side of Keselowski's car at Atlanta Motor Speedway, sent it airborne into the catch fence in front of a full grandstand. Edwards was responding to contact from Keselowski in a previous race. The response he chose sent Keselowski's car flying at the fence at over 150 miles per hour. That is the specific category of hatred that Brad Keselowski generated. Not the casual dislike of a driver people found annoying. The kind of hatred that makes a champion calculate the exact moment to end your afternoon permanently. He won the 2012 championship. He did it while the garage was still processing the fact that he had told a reporter, on camera, at Bristol, loudly, without any apparent concern for who was listening, that Kyle Busch was an ass. Not a difficult competitor, not someone he had issues with. An ass. The fans who loved Kyle Busch, and there were some, though they were outnumbered, did not forget that. Brad Keselowski made the list at number 10 because the sport always respected how hard he competed, even when it could not stand him. Number 9, Joey Logano. Tony Stewart called him a scared little kid, a little rich kid who never worked for anything. That was 2013. Logano was 23 years old and had just been shoved by Stewart at Watkins Glen after a racing incident. Stewart did the shoving, but the words he said afterward, the specific contempt in the description of a driver who had been groomed by the sports establishment from the moment he turned 16, captured something that a significant portion of NASCAR's audience already felt. Logano had been fast-tracked, given opportunities that other drivers scraped and fought for years to reach. And when he drove for those opportunities with the specific aggression of a driver who had been told his whole life that he was exceptional, when he moved people who were in his way without what the garage considered adequate apology, the response from the community was exactly what Stewart's words suggested. The Matt Kenseth incident at Charlotte in 2015 was the moment that made everything permanent. Kenseth, running for a championship, needing a good result, was deliberately wrecked by Logano under circumstances that the garage interpreted as intentional payback for a contact incident earlier in the season. Kenseth was suspended for 2 races for what he did in response. Logano won the 2018 championship. The crowd at Homestead was not entirely enthusiastic. He sits at number 9 because the sport could acknowledge his talent while never fully forgiving what that talent occasionally chose to do with itself. Number 8. Denny Hamlin. This one is complicated, and the complication is the point. Denny Hamlin is the best driver in NASCAR history who never won a championship. 3 Daytona 500s, dozens of wins, more than 2 decades of competing at the highest level with the kind of consistency that only the truly elite can sustain across that many seasons. And yet, the 55-plus audience, The fans who remember when NASCAR was something you planned your Sunday around never fully gave him their heart. Part of it was the co-ownership of 23XE Racing, his connection to the legal battles and the boardroom politics that older fans found complicated and exhausting. Part of it was the personality, sharp, opinionated, never quite willing to soften an edge that occasionally made people in the garage and in the grandstands feel like they were being talked down to. Part of it was simpler than any of that. He was brilliant, and he knew it. And the fans who had grown up watching Dale Earnhardt race like a man who had something to prove every single lap, who had watched Richard Petty win with a humility that made the victories feel like gifts to the sport rather than personal achievements, those fans looked at Denny Hamlin and saw a driver who was never going to give them that particular feeling. Denny Hamlin raced for 20 years at the highest level this sport offered. 3 Daytona 500s, dozens of wins, a legacy that the record books will carry long after the debates have quieted. The championship never came. And somehow, in the specific, irrational, completely human way that NASCAR fandom has always worked, that felt like the right outcome to half the people watching. That is number 8. Make of it what you will. Number 7. Kevin Harvick. Kevin Harvick arrived in the Cup Series under circumstances that would have broken a different kind of driver before his career properly started. February 2001. Dale Earnhardt died at Daytona. Richard Childress Racing needed someone in the number 3 car for the following week at Rockingham. They called Harvick, a 25-year-old Busch Series driver who had made exactly 1 Cup Series start in his career. He won at Rockingham in just his 3rd Cup start. Not just competed, won. The crowd did not know how to feel. They were still grieving Earnhardt. They were watching a young man they had never heard of win in a car that carried the weight of the most painful loss the sport had experienced in decades. They wanted to cheer. They were not sure they had permission yet. Harvick gave them permission by being exactly who he was. Aggressive, unfiltered. A driver who raced with the same absolute refusal to be moved that had defined the man whose seat he had inherited. He was not trying to be Earnhardt. He was just built the same way, from the same philosophy that the track owed you nothing and that every position had to be taken rather than given. The Joey Logano incidents confirmed what the garage already suspected. The Joey Logano shove at Texas in 2014, Harvick grabbing Logano by the fire suit after the race, pulling him toward him, the specific physicality of a man who had decided the conversation was over and the confrontation was beginning, was not a man losing his temper. It was a man being exactly who he had always been. The fans who loved him for exactly that reason. The ones who did not love him found the same quality exhausting. He won the 2014 championship. He won over 50 Cup races. He retired in 2023 as one of the most successful drivers of his generation, and half the garage threw him a party, and the other half quietly exhaled. Number 6. Tony Stewart. The argument for Tony Stewart being the most genuinely complicated driver in NASCAR history starts with this. He won 3 championships. He drove sprint cars on Saturday nights while competing for Cup titles on Sundays. He bought the Eldora Speedway dirt track and kept it running because he believed the sport owed something to the tracks that had built the drivers who made the sport famous. He was loyal to everything that had made him before the big money arrived to make him bigger. And he also threw a helmet at Matt Kenseth at Bristol in 2012. He shoved Joey Logano at Watkins Glen in 2013. He walked across a dark track at Canandaigua Motorsports Park in August 2014 and was involved in the death of Kevin Ward Jr., a 20-year-old sprint car driver who had climbed out of his car on the track and was struck by Stewart's car. No charges were filed. A grand jury declined to indict. Stewart himself said it was the most difficult experience of his life and that he would carry it always. The crowd that had spent years loving Tony Stewart, the dirt track crowd, the short track crowd, the fans who saw in him the version of NASCAR that existed before the corporate sponsors arrived, did not abandon him after Canandaigua. But something shifted. The specific, uncomplicated joy of watching a man who raced on Saturday nights and won championships on Sundays became something more complicated, more weighted. He sits at number 6 because the sport he loved never produced a simpler verdict on what he was: champion and villain, hero and cautionary tale, the driver who bought a dirt track and the driver who walked across a dark one. Both things. Always both things. Number 5, Jimmie Johnson. 7 championships. 7 consecutive seasons at the top of the standings from 2006 through 2010, then again in 2013. The most dominant run in the modern era of the sport, a record that only he and Richard Petty and Dale Earnhardt have achieved. And Johnson achieved it with a consistency that made the other two look almost random by comparison. And the crowd booed him, not because he was dirty, not because he moved people or threw helmets or walked across dark tracks, because he was perfect, because week after week the blue and white number 48 arrived at the front of the field with the specific inevitability of something that had been engineered rather than raced into position. Chad Knaus, his crew chief, was the most penalized crew chief of his era, caught repeatedly with cars that did not conform to the specifications, that had been adjusted in ways the rulebook did not permit. The wins kept coming, the penalties kept arriving, the championships kept accumulating. The fans who loved Jimmie Johnson loved his consistency. The ones who booed him felt that perfection, especially engineered perfection, was the most un-NASCAR quality a driver could possess. Dale Earnhardt had won by being dangerous. Richard Petty had won by being precise. Jimmie Johnson won by being inevitable. The sport respected it. The grandstands never fully warmed to it. Number 4, Jeff Gordon. Jeff Foxworthy made a joke about Jeff Gordon. He said you might be a redneck if you think Jeff Gordon needs to go back to California. The joke worked because it was true. Not the sentiment. The accuracy of the observation. Jeff Gordon did not sound like NASCAR. He did not look like NASCAR. He came from Vallejo, California, in a sport built by and for the American Southeast, and he arrived at Hendrick Motorsports at 21 years old and proceeded to win 4 championships and 93 races. The beer cans at Talladega were real. The sustained booing at tracks across the Southeast was real. The specific fury of a fan base watching their sport being dominated by someone who did not fit their image of what the sport was supposed to be. That was as real as anything NASCAR produced in the 1990s. And then something changed. It changed slowly, the way it always changes. When the driver the crowd hated becomes old enough and familiar enough that the hatred softens into something that still contains the original feeling, but has lost the sharp edge. When the California kid becomes the veteran, when the Rainbow Warrior becomes the elder statesman. By the time Gordon retired in 2015, the tracks that had thrown beer cans at him were standing up. He never changed. The crowd did. That is number 4. The driver who made the sport hate him for winning too much, too well, from the wrong place, and who outlasted every reason the crowd had ever given itself to boo. Number 3, Dale Earnhardt Jr. He did not win 7 championships like his father. He did not win 200 races like Richard Petty. He won 26 cup races across 18 years and retired because his brain had absorbed more concussions than any doctor could responsibly ignore. And for 15 consecutive years, from 2003 through 2017, NASCAR fans voted him the most popular driver in the sport, every single year, without interruption, a record that still stands. The number is not complicated. It is the most direct statement the sports fans have ever made about what they value, about the specific quality in a driver that produces loyalty that does not depend on championships or win counts or the kind of dominance that makes a driver impossible to root against. Dale Earnhardt Jr. was genuine, not performed genuine. Actually genuine. The down-to-earth kid from Kannapolis who grew up watching his father race and who lost his father on the last lap of the Daytona 500 in front of the entire country, who appeared on MTV Cribs and in a Jay-Z music video and brought NASCAR into spaces it had never reached before. Not because he was chasing relevance, but because he was himself wherever he went, and himself happened to be someone an enormous number of people recognized. The 2001 Pepsi 400 at Daytona. 5 months after February 18th, the first race back at the track where his father had died. Earnhardt Jr. in the lead on the final lap. Crossing the finish line first. 180,000 people in the grandstands making a sound that nobody in that building had words for. He said later that he had thought about his father the whole race, that he could feel him there. 15 Most Popular Driver Awards, 2 Daytona 500 wins, a career that never produced a championship and never needed one to explain why the grandstands were fullest and the merchandise lines were longest wherever the number 8 or number 88 showed up. He sits at number 3 because the 2 drivers ahead of him built the sport from the ground up, and because everything Dale Earnhardt Jr. became was built on what those 2 men gave him before he was old enough to understand the gift. Number 2, Richard Petty. 200 wins. Say it slowly. 200 wins. In an era when the schedule was brutal and the cars were dangerous, and the difference between winning and ending up in the wall was a margin so thin it barely existed. Richard Petty from Level Cross, North Carolina. The son of Lee Petty, himself a champion, himself a winner, himself a man who had built something from nothing in the early years of the sport. And then Richard arrived and did something with what his father had built that nobody could have predicted, and nobody has matched since. 200 wins, 7 championships, the Daytona 500 7 times. The man they called the king before the title was a cliché, when it was simply the only word adequate to describe what he had done and kept doing and refused to stop doing across a career that stretched from 1958 to 1992. He was not just loved because he won. He was loved because of how he won, with a dignity and an accessibility that the sport built its identity around. Richard Petty signed autographs until there was nobody left to sign for. He stopped and talked to fans who approached him with the specific patience of a man who understood that the people in the grandstands were not interrupting his career. They were the reason the career existed. The cowboy hat, the sunglasses, the smile that his grandson Adam inherited, and that the sport mourned losing when it lost Adam at New Hampshire in 2000. Richard Petty is number 2 because there is only one answer for number 1, and both men, the King and the Intimidator, built the sport that every other driver on this list competed in. Without Richard Petty, there is no NASCAR as it exists. Without the next name, there is no NASCAR as it feels. Number 1, Dale Earnhardt Sr. This was never a competition. The black number 3, the Intimidator. The man who dropped out of school in the 9th grade in Kannapolis, North Carolina, and raced his way out of poverty and 2 divorces, and no options except the ones he made for himself with his own hands, and the specific unwillingness to be stopped that defined every lap he ever turned. 7 championships, 76 wins, the only driver in NASCAR history to win in 4 consecutive decades. The most recognizable car in the history of the sport. That black Chevrolet, that number 3. Recognizable from 300 yards away in a field of 43 cars moving at 200 miles per hour. He was not just the most loved driver in NASCAR history. He was the most loved thing NASCAR ever produced. The blue-collar hero. The man who raced the way working people worked. Hard, without apology, with the understanding that nobody was going to hand you anything, and that every position on the track had to be taken rather than waited for. He tried to win the Daytona 500 for 20 years. 20 years of heartbreak. A tire on the last lap in 1990, mechanical failures. Bad luck. The specific cruelty of a sport that does not owe anyone anything, and that reminded him of that fact at Daytona, specifically and repeatedly. In 1998, he finally won it. The garage lined pit road as he drove by. Mechanics from other teams. Crew members who competed against him every week. Everyone who had ever watched him try to win that race. They gave him a standing ovation that pit road had never produced for any other driver. He cried in victory lane. The Intimidator. The man who had rattled cages and moved rivals and said exactly what he thought in every interview for 25 years. He sat in the car and cried. 3 years later, he was gone. Last lap. Turn 3. The same track. 49 years old. 2 months from his 50th birthday. The sport he left behind was different from the one he had entered. Safer. Bigger. More watched. More loved. Not because of any single rule or any single event, because of what he had spent 26 years building every time he strapped into the number 3 and went racing. That is number 1. That has always been number 1. That will always be number 1. 10 drivers. 10 completely different relationships between a man and the people watching him race. Some of them the crowd hated for winning too much. Some for winning the wrong way. Some for being from the wrong place, or saying the wrong things, or making enemies in the wrong order. And at the top, the ones the sport built its identity around. The ones who gave 60 years of fans a reason to be there every Sunday. The king, the Intimidator, and the son who carried both of their names into every race he ever ran. This sport has never produced anything more loved than those 3 names. It probably never will.